there's a sort of Korean carve-out. There's a sort of exceptionalism that is applied to analysis of Korea, that it can't be dealt with, that we can't use the tools that we've used in other confrontations before to deal with North Korea. This is my fundamental disagreement with the path that we're going down now, which is that we can't use the tools of deterrence and brinkmanship the way that we used them in the Cold War. I mean, Iran's a natural example, but let's go back to the big example, the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
And the simple fact is, we've sort of come to think that nuclear deterrence is a kind of concession, that if we end up adopting a deterrence framework with North Korea, that's somehow letting them win because we've in effect, de facto acknowledge that they are a nuclear state and that we have to deal with them as such, and that we're then somehow relying on their good faith and trust in order to not be in a war. That's nonsense. I mean, the truth is deterrence is a massively difficult and vigilant process. And so by calling for a deterrence, by calling for essentially mutually assured destruction rather than a preemptive war, you're making a choice that is going to be very vigorous and in its own way, one that's very strong on military defense.
I want to be careful in making this point because I'm not an expert here, and better people than me, smarter people than me, more committed people than me have been working on this issue for a long time. But when I hear this, one reason that my bullshit detector goes completely crazy is that there is, to me, a way things look when you're terrified of something actually happening. And the way that looks is not just you're upset about it or you think about opening up the most costly possible solution, but that you actually are willing to make serious sacrifices to make the least costly solutions work out. So it is known that North Korea has, for an extremely long period of time, wanted to have one-on-one meetings with the American president.
Right.
Like that is just something they have wanted forever. It is something that in terms of lives and money is essentially costless to us. Now, we don't like it. It feels maybe humiliating. It feels like a bad precedent to set. You don't want to reward this kind of bad behavior. But those are pretty wan excuses when you're saying, on the other hand, the proliferation of biological weapons and the possible nuclear annihilation of the Korean Peninsula.
Mm-hmm.
And the fact that we keep oscillating in this conversation between North Korea is so dangerous that we possibly need to launch a first strike that will lead to hundreds of thousands of people being killed. Because if we don't do that, the long-term outcomes will be even worse and maybe it'll be millions killed. But also, they're not such a big deal that we want to break our discomfort with going and meeting one-on-one with Kim Jong-un. There's just something about it that is so completely unbalanced that it makes me wonder how much of this is an actual analysis of the situation and how much of this is there is a momentum towards conflict, towards drama, towards kinetic outcomes in the Washington foreign policy establishment. It's a space of people always looking to act grandly on the historical stage. And sometimes it feels like it is always looking for a crisis, always looking for something that justifies its own existence for being and its own reasons for panic.
I agree completely with the concept that there is a momentum for war that is gathering right now. And I think it's a poisonous fact because one of the things that we know about Washington is that there is a certain social and professional benefit to endorsing a gathering idea. Present company accepted, the truth is heterodox thinking is not always rewarded in Washington, as you know. And so there are a number of people in what we can call the sort of think tank establishment who are gradually easing into the idea that we can't afford to wait on North Korea. And I think that's a dangerous development. I'll give you an example of what I mean. When I was working recently on thinking through policy outcomes, I was reading around and came upon an op-ed that was published in the New York Times in December of 2002, written by a otherwise worthy think tank scholar who was arguing why a war in Iraq was an absolute necessity because, as he put it, it was either war now or war later, and war later will be much worse. It'll be on their terms, not ours. You could transpose the language almost with perfect fidelity onto the North Korea debate right now. And I circulated this among some friends who focus on these kinds of issues, and we were all struck by the way in which the sort of desiccated language of escalation and war is just reapplied in this new context. There's a real danger. It sounds hyperbolic to compare it to Iraq and to say that we're sort of moving in that direction. But that's the conclusion I reached when I was there. Was the last line in my story was that before we go down the road into Korea where we don't really understand what we're doing, let's be sure we're not doing something similar in Iraq. And Nick Kristof, who was in North Korea a few weeks later, ended up coming to a similar view.
Something that I think about hearing that relates to what I've come to think of as a pretty significant analytical fallacy in Washington. And it happens in all issue areas. Policy experts in general, always and everywhere, underestimate the capacity to muddle through something.
Mm-hmm.
There's always this quality to draw like the chart and be like, well, at some point the lines on the chart need to meet. And if they don't, I mean, I see it in healthcare, which is a less weighted example where people are like, it can't possibly keep going on like this. So either the system is going to collapse or we're going to have single payer reform or some kind of overhaul. But actually, people are willing to absorb more pain and more disorder and more mess and just let a kind of broken system flail forward, as far as I can tell, basically forever. And so there have been 15, 20 years now of people saying employers can't possibly allow it, but then they do, and it just keeps going. And you see this a lot in foreign policy, this feeling that as if it's a logic problem. And, at some point we need to fix it. And so like either we fix it now or we fix it later, but it'll have to be fixed. And so what you're really weighing is a cost between doing something now and doing something later. But the way the world just works, it seems most things don't end up like that. You just end up with suboptimal outcomes for a very long time, and you sort of make it work. And I feel like that underestimation of the capacity to muddle through is really profound.
Yeah, I think there's a false binary choice here that's being presented, that it's either war in North Korea or something else. The truth is, the fantasy of the big fix is so seductive. It's the idea that—
Let's steal that, the fantasy of the big fix.
I think that book probably comes out, last week. But that's the illusion here. And the language that we heard around the natural example to return, obviously to Iraq, is the notion that we were going to go into this place, we were going to fiddle with a few knobs on the sociology and politics of the Middle East, and we would be presented with this solution that would satisfy all of our hopes. And the reality was obviously nothing like that at all. And I think the truth is that in the Korean predicament, at least, there are a host of intermediate steps that would allow us to do let's call it optimized muddling through, rather than some grand historical solution.